exciting. I'm just the moderator.
Mr. Morris Mutella, please go on stage. Please begin.
Okay, let's start. If this is what we have to do, we'll do it. The way we're going to do it is to handle this panel is I will make a few opening remarks, and then I'll present each of the speaker, and we'll let each of them to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes. I encourage the audience to ask questions. It doesn't necessarily need to be a question. If you have a comment or a statement, you can do that also. By the way, we always call it questions, and eventually it is transformed, into a comments and a statement. So that's okay with me. Now, first, I would like to say that last night, before I went to bed, I was thinking that after what happened yesterday, that all what was true before yesterday is not true anymore. And then on my way to Jerusalem this afternoon, I said to myself, well, as usual, in this crisis for so many years, we go one step forward and then 2 or 3 steps backwards. And this is what happened today, that the senior member of the parliament, the Iranian parliament, made the statement that they are not going to approve what was decided yesterday. So that's the nature of this crisis. It used to be, and probably for, I don't know if forever, but for some time it is going to be the same. So before we start, I just want to remind everybody, I'm sure we all know, that actually this program has been going on for almost 30 years. The Shah was the first one to initiate the program. And surprisingly, right after the revolution, actually Khomeini frees the program. And then after another few years, and I think this was the outcome of the massive attack of Saddam Hussein on the Iranians, probably this was a reason, or another reason is they resumed the program, and since then actually it accelerated up until today. What I also would like to remind everybody is that Israel, maybe not the only one, but from the Israeli perspective, we were the first one, or we have taken the first major step back in 1993, after the first Iraqi war, the Desert Storm operation. Israel and the Israeli Air Force had a budget frame of $2.5 billion to buy new jets. And on the table, there was a proposal to sell to Israel another F-16. And for this amount of money, we could have about 50 to 55 airplanes, which it was very important. We are always short in number of airplanes in our fleet. But then came out the idea that on the table there is another option, and the other option is the F-15I. For those who are not familiar with this airplane, this is a 2-engine, much longer range, and actually have the capacity to do something from here all the way up to a range in Iran. So this was a major decision by the government of Israel to buy only 25 airplanes instead of 55, just because we have seen this threat is raising. So this was the first step that we were taken. There was another thing that it takes time. It depends not only on the Israelis, but also on other air forces in other countries. And the other thing was that Saddam Hussein was the first one, actually, to transform the nature of any type of violence, if I may say, in the Middle East into a regional and not as a singular or local conflict as it used to be up to early 90s. Which means every time that we, the Israelis, unfortunately have to face a conflict and the armies were engaged, it always stayed local, either in the Golan Heights or in Sinai or, within the territory of Israel. And the conflict was handled both sides, by the Israelis, and sometimes more than one country, like it happened back in 1973 and 67, Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. But basically, the scenario was a local scenario. When Saddam Hussein brought the ballistic missiles into the region, then actually what we see is the potential scenario is going to be a regional, which means that more than one country is involved. It is required to do many things: special equipment, training, cooperation between different militaries, and above all, cooperation between governments, which mean coalitions. So from then on, coalition is not only in diplomacy, but also when we speak about military action, it needs to be done and executed by a coalition. This is something that needs to be understood when we deal with the Iranian dilemma. And I think the Israelis and the rest of the world have had some experience which actually disturbed the understanding of this kind of approach. And this is what happened back in 1981 in Iraq. Because again, this was a single spot. It was done under secrecy. And the people woke up in the morning and the problem simply dismantled. This is not the issue today. We are talking about totally different type of dilemma. Which mean, and I will close actually with this remark, which mean that, first of all, it always needs to be a combination of diplomacy and military option at the same time. Nothing stands alone. There is no way and there is no chance to reach any achievements if we do whatever we do by diplomacy and it is not backed by the option of military, or by a military option. And it doesn't necessarily need to be an ultimate, a total option, but I mean it needs to be backed by power. And the truth is also the other way around, which means there is no chance to get rid of this dilemma if we think narrowly military-oriented, which means military which is not organized and backed and pre-planned by a coalition will never succeed. And when I say, and again, it is very important maybe at the beginning to determine what does it mean success. And people think about destroying some spots. This is not success. Or putting some sanctions on the Iranians, or doing anything like what is undertaken right now. The goal should be, and this is the objective of everything is to neutralize the will of the leadership of the Iranians to terminate the program. As long as you do not achieve this goal, you always have to assume that somehow, in some way, they find a way to resume the program. So I would encourage the speakers when they give us some proposal, what should we do in the future, please, or maybe argue with that, but please bear in mind that the objective is to try and to neutralize the will of the Iranian leadership to stop the program. Otherwise, it is not an ultimate solution. And I would, at this point, I would like to invite Mr. Elliot Abrams. And I know that people know you, and you have already participated in some panels here, but I do my job and I present you in a few words. Elliot Abrams is a senior fellow for the Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor in the administration of President George W. Bush, where he supervised U.S. policy in the Middle East for the White House. Mr. Abrams is currently a member of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council, which directs the activities of U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. We stop here. Okay. If it's enough for you, it's enough for me.
Thank you, General. I think the most significant thing that has changed with respect to Iran is that something happened since June that very few people anticipated or predicted, and that is that the regime is faltering. Divisions between the regime and the people are growing. Divisions within the regime are growing. And it seems to me that our goal, and here I might say I think I disagree, the objective should be to bring down that regime. That would change, if you think through what the Middle East would look like after the collapse of that regime, it would change the politics of the Gulf. It would change the politics of the entire Middle East. It would change the politics of the Islamic world and of Islamism and Salafism in the world, Sunni and Shia. I think in the current nuclear negotiations, there are two goals we need to keep in mind. The first is that we not legitimize the regime and abandon the opposition, and that is a real danger. As American diplomats sit with the regime, we can expect that it will use this for propaganda purposes, both internationally and domestically. It is possible to negotiate with the regime, yet make it clear that we despise the regime and wish it would fall. And the example I would give you is President Reagan, who did this with the Soviet Union. He negotiated with every Soviet leader who lived long enough to meet with him. They kept, as Reagan said, they kept dying on me. But while he met with them, he also made it clear. He said, this is an evil empire that will end on the ash heap of history. So that people like Natan Sharansky, sitting in a prison, understood that those negotiations were not an abandonment of him or of the dissidents. The second goal should be in these negotiations that we do not agree to allowing the free, unlimited operation of enrichment at Natanz just to buy a relatively short amount of time. Time actually, I think, cuts both ways. If there were a year, let us say, that we bought through this proposed deal, it would mean that Israel would have that much more time to perfect its missile defenses, which it is working on very actively. And it would mean more time for the internal protests in Iran to build. But, of course, it also gives the regime time to suppress that opposition, to continue to work on missiles and warheads, and unless we make it part of the deal, it would give them more time to learn how to enrich uranium better and faster. I must say I do think that this proposal from the Ayatollahs, which they may or may not actually mean, we'll find out, this willingness to support about 1,000 kilos of LEU is to me a great sign of weakness on their part. If they go through with it, the only possible reason for doing so would be to reduce the pressure on them and alleviate the possibility of more significant sanctions for, let us say, a year. I don't know how to interpret that except as fear on the part of the regime that unless they gain time, they're going to lose control of the internal situation. And conversely, if there were more sanctions, if, for example, it were possible to stop gasoline imports into Iran, then they really fear for their own domestic situation and their right to do so. So I think if we're going to do any kind of bargain with them, it should be a very hard bargain. We are not in a weak position. They're the guys whose government may well fall in the coming years. I think the most critical thing, though, is to do absolutely nothing that weakens the real possibility for a solution to the problem. And the real possibility isn't a short-term deal over the exportation of LEU. The real possibility is the downfall of this regime. That's the only solution. A year ago, I think, had I said that, well, I don't know that I would have said it this way a year ago, because a year ago it looked so far away. People would say, oh, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, who knows, regime won't last forever, but now we look at an Iran where we can talk about 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, who knows? The idea that this regime is unstable is clear to us as it is clear to those in the regime. That, it seems to me, has got to be the ultimate goal because it is the only solution. Thank you.
If I may just say that we are mixing between the goal and the way to reach the goal. Maybe the only way, or one of the ways to neutralize their will is to change the regime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In your opinion, I believe that this is the only way to do that, which I might agree, and maybe we'll hear some other comments about that. All right, I will invite Mrs. Genevieve Abdou. She's the director of Iran program at the Century Foundation, a Washington and a New York-based think tank. Her current research focus is contemporary Iran and political Islam. She is the editor of a newly launched website. She was formerly the liaison officer for the Alliance of the Civilization, a UN initiative under Secretary General Kofi Annan. Please.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. I thought, given my own expertise in analyzing the internal dynamic inside Iran, that I would give you just a brief overview in the short time that we have of where the state and society stand now after the elections. And I'm a bit less optimistic than Mr. Abrams as to the time frame of any sort of collapse of the regime, and I hope that what I'm going to mention to you in the next few minutes will convince you. I think that even though we have seen the opposition movement in a much stronger position today, certainly than it was 10 years ago when the demonstrations occurred in 1999, that the regime has been militarized. And on that point, I'd like to sort of begin my brief remarks. What has happened on the side of the state since the elections and really throughout the electoral process has been a very public display of the power that the Islamic Revolutionary Guards have over the system. Now, their original purpose, and perhaps this sort of often gets lost in the discussion of the Revolutionary Guards, their original purpose, as conceptualized by Ayatollah Khomeini, was to be a popular militia force to monitor the remainder of the Shah's military apparatus. And that was the reason that they were initially established. Then they had a role in the Iraq-Iran war. But when Ayatollah Khamenei, the current supreme leader, when he took power after Khomeini died, he began the slow development of the Revolutionary Guards into an extraordinarily powerful force in Iran today. And today they control they not only have a military presence, but they control significant parts of the Iranian economy, and they also are a military presence outside Iran. And as you probably read in the press, they have a great foothold in Iraq in the form of the Quds Force. Now again, this has been something that Khamenei has engineered through his own sort of vision of how the system should function. More importantly, in this last electoral campaign, it was clear that the Revolutionary Guards now have a great role in politics in Iran. Not only did leading generals within the Guards publicly endorse Ahmadinejad, but a particular commander, Mr. Jafari, he even issued a public statement demanding that the Guards take a role in the electoral process. At the time, it was interpreted, as we know now correctly, that this was a nod to basically rig the election in Ahmadinejad's favor, and the Guards were very instrumental in this first round of voting to ensure Ahmadinejad's election. So this is how, at least, the Guards, this is the role that the Guards play now in Iranian society and in their role in the state. Of course, this is a subject of great debate inside Iran. Many conservatives, former Guardsmen themselves, including the mayor of Tehran, for example, are very much against this intrusion of the Guards into nearly every aspect of life in Iran. But unfortunately, they've been overruled. To just sum up this sort of characterization of their role, I will share with you a remark that has often been made by Mohsen Sazagara. He is a leading Iranian dissident who is now actually in Washington. And he was one of the founders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And he says, I don't know of any other organization in any country like the Revolutionary Guards. It's something like the Communist Party, the KGB, a business complex, and a mafia. And I think that this is a very, very correct description of the role and the evolution of the Guards in Iran today. It is clear that their rising power, both economically and politically, will go unchallenged. And I think that if there were any doubt, even after the election, of Khamenei's intentions for the role of the Guards, he made clear 2 weeks ago he appointed new leaders to head the Guards and the Basij militia force, which is a force that you probably read about in the newspapers in the latest demonstrations. They have also acquired enormous power under Khamenei, and their major responsibility, one of their major responsibilities, is to monitor student activism on university campuses. Now, 2 weeks ago, Khamenei appointed some of the most notorious leaders in Iran, who came from the intelligence community, to lead the Guards and the Basij force. So I think that that's a very clear sign that we will see an increasing militarization of the state and of society. Now, given this militarization, after the elections, where does the opposition movement stand? It's very difficult from the outside to try to assess their strength and to assess how cohesive the movement is at this point. But I will just share with you some of the information that I've been receiving from inside Iran since before the election. The activists inside Iran describe the movement as broad-based. So unlike 1999, when there were demonstrations, that movement was primarily comprised of students. But now, as we understand it, the opposition includes the underclass, it includes conservative Iranians, it includes religious Iranians, and it also includes Iranians who before June 12th actually were supporters of Ahmadinejad and Khamenei. So in this sense, we can see that the opposition movement now is at a much different place than it has been historically since the revolution, which of course is very significant. The big handicap, though, of this opposition movement is that it is leaderless. It has no leadership. We often read in the newspaper that the leaders are Mir Hussein Mousavi or former President Khatami. Actually, many Iranians do not look to them as the leadership of this movement. They feel that the movement has surpassed them because they are part of the regime and they are still advocating reform within an Islamic framework, reform within the current system, whereas the opposition movement believes not necessarily that there should be a revolution, but that the system has to fundamentally reform. So these people that we read about in the newspapers, the opposition movement, for the most part, does not consider them their leaders. The opposition movement has also become highly radicalized since before the election, and I want to just share with you some slogans. I made a chronology of how the slogans evolved from right before the election to September, to El-Quds Day, which was also the last demonstration that we've seen. In the short days before after the election, the demonstrators were shouting, "Where is my vote? Mousavi, Karoubi, we support you. Coup government resign." So this was an expression of the fact that they felt their vote had been stolen from them. Week 2, the slogans change. The Iranians in the streets are shouting, "Death to the dictator. I will kill he who kills my brother. The government cheats. The leader supports it." So you can see that the grievance shifted from a protest against a rigged election to now directly aiming their grievances at Khamenei, which in Iran is completely unprecedented. I think now when we hear that there's an opposition to Khamenei, there's a questioning of his legitimacy, it seems logical. But in fact, Iranians have crossed a very significant red line by now shouting in public and calling into question in public discourse in Iran not only his legitimacy as a political leader, but even more importantly, his legitimacy as in theological terms, which of course should be sort of the basis of his right to rule. As time went on, they began shouting by the 4th memorial day of the young woman who was killed in this bloody street battle that we saw in Neda. They began shouting, "Hamas is a murderer. His leadership is null and void." So this clearly demonstrates how the movement became radicalized. And the last slogan that I want to share with you, which I think is important particularly to this audience, was on El-Quds Day, the day that Iranians basically demonstrate against Israel for the Palestinian cause. The demonstrators were shouting, "Neither Gaza nor Lebanon, my life is only for Iran." So they were decrying support, Iran's continued support for Hamas and Hezbollah. Again, this is a completely different direction that the opposition movement is taking. Now, I want to just conclude this particular thought with one caveat, which is that the demonstrators in the beginning, the millions of Iranians shouting the slogans in the beginning, which expressed their grievance about the election, are different from the demonstrators who demonstrated in September on El-Quds Day, because those demonstrators now are pretty hardcore. Anyone now going out into the streets of Iran to demonstrate are pretty fearless, and this is a much smaller minority of people than the millions who demonstrated after the elections. I'll just conclude, because I think the time has run out. I'll just conclude with another pillar of the state that I think is also completely fragmented now, and that's the clerics. And we don't really hear that much about the clerics, but during the years that I worked in Iran as a foreign correspondent for The Guardian, I spent a lot of my time in Qom, the religious center, the Shiite center, and interviewed clerics. Some of the clerics that we hear about today who support Ahmadinejad, Mezbah Yazdi, many of the hardline clerics, I spent a lot of time with them to try to understand their views. And I think that what's happened that's very significant is we've seen a split within the clerical establishment that always existed but has now become public. And the clerics themselves have issued public statements calling Khamenei's legitimacy into question, basically delivering the message to the Iranian people that the human rights violations that were committed in the aftermath of the elections are un-Islamic, and that this regime is illegitimate, irrespective of the results of the election, but that the regime is illegitimate because it is not practicing Islam in a way that is understood by the Iranian population. And to me, this is an extraordinarily important development, because this is basically evidence that Khamenei and Ahmadinejad are not fit to rule. And I think that of all the sort of challenges that the state faces at this point in time, that this is sort of their gravest challenge. Thank you.
May I ask you a short question? It is very clear, but when I listen to you, I see that you describe what is going on there, and you are mostly focusing on the sometime before and after the elections. If I am asking you to predict what's going to happen within 6 months or 12 months or 18 months from now, where does it go?
Well, I think that we're a long way from revolution or regime change. How long? No one can answer this, and it's always very risky to predict Iranian politics. What I think in the best case scenario, you will see the ascendance of Rafsanjani, or a figure like him. Former President Rafsanjani is someone who is very much a regime insider, but he now has one foot in the opposition movement. And this is another significant development that has happened since the election. He is now an open critic of the system, as is Mir Hussein Mousavi and former President Mohammad Khatami. But Rafsanjani is not so tainted by the system that he would be excluded from being a central sort of focus of power. And he's also the head of 2 very powerful councils inside the state. So in the best case scenario, we could hope perhaps for his rise to power, at least to acquire more power than he has today, particularly as Khamenei ages, as he becomes ill, this sort of thing. In the worst case scenario, I think that if Khamenei should die, or if he's unable to govern because he becomes too ill, the other possible scenario is that the Revolutionary Guards would then demand that they basically rule in the absence of a supreme leader. And this, I think, would be, of course, sort of the worst possible outcome for the population. But those are the 2 most immediate scenarios I see in the foreseeable future.
And what is the impact of the discussions and the negotiations which are undertaken right now on this trend? Does it support, or it is against the opposition, or it helps the regime, or the other way around?
Well, I think the view from the opposition movement, and again, I'm speaking about only a handful of people that I have contact with. There was actually in September a conference in Berlin that some opposition activists attended, came outside of Iran, and their view is that the negotiations would legitimize an illegitimate government. I mean, that's their view, and they also believe that, which will never happen, but on a lot of Iranian websites inside the country, in the run-up to these talks, the first one in Geneva, there's been a lot of discussion that there should be a representative of the opposition movement at the table. So their position is, okay, if the United States, if the 5+1 are going to legitimize this government, at least in a formal way, then we need to have a representative at the table. And I know that there have been some Iranians in the United States that have proposed this to the Obama administration. So that's sort of where they stand.
Thank you very much. Now we move on, and our next speaker is a Professor Maurice Matale. He's a professor of political science in Franklin College in Switzerland. Mr. Matale, please.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Geneva Abdo, because it's a very good introduction to what I was going to talk about, namely, what is Iranian foreign policy all about? She focused on the internal dimensions, but perhaps it would be useful to look at a brief history of Iranian foreign policy just recently, since the revolution. I would say that the best approach is what we used as Sovietologists when studying what the Russians wanted. Some of you, if you have done political science, remember the old article in 1947 by George Kennan on the dynamics of Russian foreign policy. I would use the same approach, and I would say there are two dimensions to it. One is the historical Iranian foreign policy that has been inherited from the times of the Shah, which called for a control of the region and the control of the resources of the Gulf. This certainly came to be into a full blast, literally, in 1971 when the British left the Gulf. As it was at the time, the demand for oil increased in the West. The use of supertankers to avoid the Suez Canal became even more prevalent, and the demand for oil was, of course, increasing. By the way, this is the time when the U.S. started importing more oil, and that started changing the balance of energy in the world. The second element, and let me add, by the way, Iranian foreign policy at the time of the Shah was concerned on the possibility of a two-front war, i.e. a war with two Arab countries, and keeping the Soviets out. So the alliance with the United States was very useful. In fact, Iran was involved in literally subverting at one time Iraq, because the Iraqis were subverting the Arabs on Iranian territory. There was a quid pro quo whereby the United States, the Shah decided to give up support of the Kurds, and Saddam Hussein gave up support on the Arabs in Khuzestan. Interesting enough, when Saddam Hussein was asked, why on earth did you agree first to the Algiers Agreement, which brought peace, quote unquote, between Iran and Iraq? Remember, they had been at war with Iranian divisions fighting in Iraq since 1968. He said, well, the Shah was too strong. There was nothing I could do about it. And now that there was a revolution, he decided to attack Iran and I'm not going to go into all the details what motivated him at the time. So that dimension of Iranian foreign policy has always been part of what the clerics have been doing. What the clerics added to it was, one, the Shiite dimension. If you compare with the Soviet Union, it is as if the Tsar, or Lenin was a new Tsar, and added the communist Marxist dimension. The clerics found very useful after the war with Iraq to engage in basically subverting and controlling Shiite movements and literally Shiite ethnic groups in the area. Hezbollah goes without saying, but if you have been following the press in detail, I just saw some time ago, just a few days ago, a Yemeni spokesman accusing Iran of subverting the Shiites in Yemen. Iran has also been involved in various shenanigans in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Interesting enough, they've been staying out of the Caucasus, though some time ago Azerbaijan did accuse Iran of being involved in subversion in those areas of the Caucasus. The Shiite dimension is interesting because it in many ways really buttresses Iranian security policy in the area. And it's not very costly, by the way, paying $50 or $100 a day, a week or whatever, a month to various members of organizations in Lebanon, and very likely also there is some evidence for that, in the Gaza Strip, goes a long way. That's one. Now, there is a dimension to these Shiite policies that is often forgotten. If you go back to the writings of one Ayatollah Khomeini and many other Shiite clerics, the opposition to Zionism, the State of Israel, and Jews as a whole is marked. It's there, and people have forgotten or have not wanted to look at it. The day Khomeini came to power, he made that very clear. He had done it in his writings. I may add, by the way, that when Ahmadinejad became president and during his first term, one of the first speeches he gave was how he was going to get rid of all minorities in Iran. And by the way, minorities, I don't mean only Christians, Baha'is, or Jews. Obviously, he had also the Sunnis in mind. Basically, they want a country that's Shiite, that's Persian-speaking, and is going to have a lot of clout. Now, let me add something more specific. What do they want in specific terms? And certainly, building a bomb or threatening their neighbors with it is very helpful. They want, first of all, and this goes back to the more Iranian, the Persian royal dimension, they want a status as a great power. These leaders today were socialized, and includes Ahmadinejad, under the old regime, where there was always stress on nationalism and how Iran was a great civilization. They consider themselves a Shiite great power. Do not forget that Pakistan considers a Sunni state. They want deterrence against real and imaginary enemies, I may add mostly imaginary. Again, analogy with the Soviet Union and Russia abound. They have very immediate regional concerns, and it is here I would like to add some comments. Iran lives off its oil exports. The revenues have allowed the mullahs to engage in a populist economic program of subsidies that benefit ostensibly the lower orders. For example, subsidized cement for construction, bread, rice, chicken, and other commodities. More often than not, the importation or production of such commodities is in the hands of the clerics or the Revolutionary Guards or their families. Basically, Iran is still what we call in political sociology a neo-patrimonial system. You see all these cousins, uncles, grandnephews, and whatever else that could have key positions in the system. Higher oil revenues and the higher and higher price for our barrel in the international energy market benefit Iran enormously. Iran historically, whether under the Shah or the mullahs, have aimed for greater quotas for Iran and higher prices for barrel, as opposed to the Saudi and other, quote, moderates in OPEC. The history of Arab-Iranian conflict over oil prices goes back to the 50s, and it has to do with how the Arabs undermined the Iranian efforts to increase the price of oil, even under the Shah in the 50s. Very simply, my thesis is that Iranian hegemony in the Gulf, aided and abetted by a nuclear component to keep out Western powers and regional competitors, would allow Iran to force other oil and gas producers, Emiratis, Iraqis, and Qataris, to acquiesce to Iranian dictates about energy policies. The end result would be higher revenue for Iran and greater economic stability for the regime, thus ensuring clerical control, guard control over the system. The implacable opposition to Israel fuels Iranian status and prestige, not only among the Shiite masses, but also in the Islamic world, thus delegitimizing regimes that would be more open to compromise with the state of Israel. Iranian support for Hamas is an example of it. The regime is not, I do agree with Genève, the regime internally is not as weak as it seems to be. They have a very solid control, not only on the opposition in Iran, I may add, this is on a personal note, they have an excellent control over the opposition abroad. It's always interesting to see how Iranian academics abroad, those in exile, receive very, very elaborate artistic invitations to embassy parties. I've received a few of them, and I was wondering how they managed to track me down. But I know Elliot thinks that we should push, but the regime is much stronger than it seems. They have been in power for 30 years. There is a new generation of people that has been re-socialized, young people. It's true that there is opposition amongst a lot of strata, but there are also people of a stake in the regime, and they're not ready to give it up.
Thank you very much. Our next is Professor Meir Litvak. He's Associate Professor, Department of Middle Eastern and African in Tel Aviv University. Since 1993, he was a Research Fellow, Senior Research Fellow, Visiting Assistant Professor and Lecturer at Tel Aviv University, Hebrew University, Emory University, and Cornell University. Professor Litvak educated in Tel Aviv and in Harvard University. Professor Litvak, please.
Good afternoon. I will say a few, I'm afraid, unpopular remarks. I think, first of all, as Israelis, we should be very modest at our capabilities and the limitations of our power. I think that as Israelis, I'm not talking about the U.S., but as Israel, talking about regime change is way and above our capabilities. Israel will not be able, is unable to topple the Iranian regime, and we should not speak about it. We have not been very successful in removing Hamas or Hezbollah, which are a little bit smaller than Iran. And we should not speak about, even delude ourselves or speak about regime change. I think it will be more harmful to Israel than beneficial to Israel to speak about such things. This is one thing. Secondly, I think Israel should be very careful from attacking Iran. I'm not a military man, I'm a civilian, but I don't think we have the capability of totally destroying the Iranian nuclear project. The Iranians have been very smart. Unlike Saddam Hussein, they've dispersed their nuclear facilities all over Iran. Assuming that we know everything, and I don't know, it is not sure that we can destroy every nuclear installation in Iran. Secondly, even technically, we are not the U.S. The U.S. can send hundreds of planes for 3-4 weeks in order to destroy the Iranian nuclear project. We are not able to do so. We can surprise the Iranians once, maybe twice, but not more than that. And the Israeli Air Force, as great as it is, and it is great, will not be able to destroy the Iranian project after such few attacks. And the cost to Israel may be very high. Not only it will involve us in an immediate war against Iran, but the Iranians have this terrible tendency of having very long memory. They never forget anything. And that would mean that Iran will be an eternal enemy of Israel with the justification to retaliate. Another point is that attacking Iran without clear American backing would be a disaster. So I think Israel should be very wary from speaking about attacks against Iran. I'm not saying that we should do, we should think more than twice before attacking Iran. And that should also mean that Israel should be very careful from making inflammatory statements against Iran, that we will not allow and we will not enable, and so on and so forth. These inflammatory statements are not helpful to Israel. Not only do they provide an excuse or legitimacy for Iran to go against us, and they unnecessarily increase tensions between us and Iran. And I'm not belittling the Iranian challenge to Israel, by the way. I wrote about the Iranian ideological animosity toward Israel. I believe that Iran wants to destroy Israel. Okay, so I'm not saying that the Iranians are nice people. This is a nice regime, not at all. This is a vicious, brutal regime. But inflammatory statements from Israel are not helpful to Israel. More than that, when we make such inflammatory statements and then we do not do anything, then we put ourselves in a very awkward position of a country which speaks loudly but acts softly. And this is the wrong way to do it. So I would be, again, more than that, making such inflammatory statements commit us to do something. And that would then limit our rooms of maneuver diplomatically, politically, and so on. So I think Israel should be very careful. Israeli leaders should think twice before they make such inflammatory statements against Iran. Now, what can Israel do and what should Israel do? We have to act or focus our efforts on the diplomatic arena in two ways. One is indirectly try as much as possible. We can't do much to encourage or support those states which support economic sanctions on Iran. And we should also work indirectly vis-à-vis European companies, American companies, not to do business with Iran. It has been successful, partially successful in the past. There are quite a few European companies that have cancelled joint projects with the Iranians after they had been informed about the dangers, insecurity of doing business with Iran. And Israel should pursue this course. Israel should work behind the scenes in the diplomatic effort in this 5+1 to take a tougher position against Iran, even though right now there may be an agreement with Iran, which is not the best agreement. It does not solve any problem. At the most, it postpones the danger, but that is better than nothing. In addition, Israel should and must maintain strategic coordination with the U.S. Strategic coordination with the U.S. is an absolute necessity and first priority for Israel, which means, and here I'll be very unpleasant and political, which means it has priority over every other thing, every other diplomatic issue, which means that Israeli-American alliance against Iran is more important than certain houses in the West Bank. Because this is our existence, and this is not our, and therefore it has absolute, should have absolute priority. Another issue, we should try to work with the moderate or the pragmatic states in the Arab world against Iran. There is fear in the Arab world from Iran, especially among Gulf states who are afraid about Iran hegemony. They go back to terms as the Persian threat, as the they call the Iranians Majus, that is the Zoroastrians, going back to almost the racist terminology, using racist terminology against the Iranians today. Israel should exploit it. Israel should try, of course, quietly, behind the scenes, not publicly, try to work with pragmatic Arab states against Iran, which means, again, that we have to pay a certain price on the Palestinian arena. Not that we should give up essential strategic interests vis-à-vis the Palestinians, but we have to do something in the Palestinian track, not that it would solve all our problems with the Arab world, not that all Middle Eastern problems would be solved once there is some sort of settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. I'm not that naive. But the Palestinian issue is an obstacle to better cooperation between us and the Saudis and the Egyptians and so on. They will not be our friends. They will not love us. Okay? I don't delude myself. But we can work together to some extent against the Iranians, at least to limit the Iranian track of success. And we have to remember, just to give an example, both in 2006 and in the war against Gaza, both the Saudis and the Egyptians, in fact, gave us a green light to act against Iranian clients in the region. The Saudis were very happy that we attacked Hezbollah and very disappointed that we did not destroy Hezbollah. Just to give an example, Saudi clerics issued fatwas saying that Muslims should not pray for Hezbollah when it fights Israel. And again, the same thing with Hamas. As much as the Arab states sympathize with the Palestinians, they did not care very much when we fought Hamas because they understood that Hamas is an Iranian client. And when both Hamas and Hezbollah eventually did suffer blows from Israel, and the 2006 war has been more successful than we imagined after when it ended, Iran suffered a certain blow. And this, we should also focus on our efforts on this regard. And finally, if nothing else works, we should use explicit deterrence against Iran. That is, if, and God forbid, Iran becomes closer to nuclear capability, Israel, either quietly or publicly, should make it very clear to Iran that any attack on Israel would mean the destruction of Iran, which is something which President Peres said in the past, and we should say it much more, again, either explicitly or anonymous sources on the press and so on. I think this should not be abandoned, such a possibility. And finally, this I'll finish, just one quick response to what Genev said about the Pasdaran, which I fully agree with you when you said if there is any other organization comparable to that. There is one organization with some differences, and this was the German SS, which was also sort of a party army plus business conglomeration, had political clout, etc. Although I agree that the Pasdaran are not, they don't have the extermination camps and so on. But aside from that, they're very similar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Litvak. Our next is Professor Erwin Kotler from Canada. He's a professor of constitutional and comparative law scholar, international human rights lawyer, consul to prisoners of conscience. He is a public intellectual community leader and a peace activist. Professor Kotler is a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada when he issued the first ever national justice initiative against racism and hate. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My basic thesis underlying my remarks today is this, that Ahmadinejad's Iran, and I always add when I say this, and I use this term to distinguish it from the people and publics of Iran who are otherwise the targets of massive domestic repression, has emerged as a clear and present danger not only to Israel and the Jewish people, but to international peace and security, as well as to its own people. Indeed, what we are witnessing in Ahmadinejad's Iran is the toxic convergence of four distinct yet interrelated threats. One, the danger of a nuclear threat. Two, the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. Three, the danger of state-sponsored terror. And four, the danger, which was unmasked because it existed even before the fraudulent elections of June 12th, the persistent, pervasive, and pernicious assault on the human rights of the Iranian people. Let there be no mistake about it. Iran is in standing violation of the obligations that it has not to develop enriched uranium to become an atomic power, and not only has it violated UN Security Council resolutions and the like, it has been a serial deceiver with respect to the nature and extent of its violations. You know, we woke up this morning to the news that, and you can look at the front page today, Herald Tribune, New York Times, audits, that a draft accord had been signed between the U.S. and Iran on the nuclear issue. Well, as the chairman told us, that has already been repudiated by Iran. This is part of that kind of serial deception and duplicity, and it may yet get signed. I have some benchmarks about how one should identify it, but I just want to move on in this regard. Second, Iran has already committed the crime of incitement to genocide prohibited under the Genocide Convention. Third, Iran appointed as its defense minister, while negotiations were going on with the Western powers, appointed a man, Ahmed Vahidi, who has been held responsible for perpetrating the massive terrorist attack on the Jewish Community Center, the AMIA, in Argentina, and where there is an Interpol arrest warrant out for the defense minister of Iran, who continues to be welcome in capitals. Four, the Iranian regime, as I mentioned, is the author of widespread and systematic attacks on the Iranian people, which include arrests, beatings, torture, rape, murder, disappearances, and executions. In fact, executions since June 12th of those engaged in the protest, constituting what my colleagues have called crimes against humanity against its own people. The whole overladen with Stalinist show trials and coerced confessions. And all of this is accompanied by a generic culture of impunity, where the gross abuses of human rights and the pervasive violations of international law are sanitized rather than sanctioned, indulged in rather than held to account. So this brings me to the fundamental point and second part of my remarks. What then needs to be done, must be done? How do we combat this impunity? How do we prevent as well as combat these threats? Number one, engagement with Iran cannot be a process that is indefinite, open-ended, and inconclusive. That will only fuel serial violations and serial duplicity. There must be defined timeframes within which this negotiation or engagement is carried out, clear benchmarks, clear objectives for the resolution of the threat, and the like. That is not now happening in the UN, US, and other negotiations with Iran around the nuclear issue. Second, while we focus understandably and necessarily on the nuclear threat, such engagement or negotiations must not be limited to the nuclear threat alone. Otherwise, it runs the risk of ignoring or marginalizing or sanitizing the other three threats to which I referred and which are inextricably bound up also with the nuclear threat. The danger of state sanctioned incitement to genocide, state sponsorship of terrorism, massive domestic repression of the Iranian people. At this point, if one focuses only on the nuclear issue from a strategic point of view, we run the risk, and with an accord that is only on the nuclear issue, and an imperfect one at that, of not only emboldening the regime, but indeed appearing to abandon, if not in fact abandon, the protesters themselves. Which brings me now to a third initiative. Unlike the nuclear threat, which Iran even denies that it is engaged in developing nuclear weapons, and there are many who sometimes question whether in fact there is conclusive evidence in that regard. What is clear is that the evidence regarding the other three threats that I mentioned is clear, comprehensive, and compelling. Accordingly, engagement needs to be organized around the four sets of threats. If Secretary of State Hillary Clinton repeated yet again yesterday the prospect of crippling sanctions should a nuclear accord not be reached, I believe what is necessary is to develop a strategy, but a serious strategy, of targeted, calibrated sanctions that engage the other three sets of threats. Time does not permit to go into these comprehensive and calibrated set of sanctions, so I'll just use some one-liners for that purpose. Directly target the refined petroleum imports in Iran. Cut energy investment. Target the Iranian banking industry, and particularly the central bank. Sanction companies that enable Iranian domestic repression by selling them surveillance equipment and the like. Target the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and those who do business with them. It's not always understood that the Revolutionary Guards, who are increasingly engaged in the militarization of Iran, as Genevieve told us, control over 80% of Iran's foreign commerce, and use domestic law for purposes of engaging in travel bans and asset seizures against leaders in Iran who are engaged themselves in furthering any and all of these threats. Brings me now at this point to the fourth initiative that needs to be taken. As I mentioned earlier, Iran has already committed the crime of incitement to genocide. Indeed, the witness testimony before our Canadian Foreign Affairs Parliamentary Committee, which has been looking into the danger of a nuclear genocidal rights violating terrorist sponsoring Iran, has already determined that the critical mass of precursors respecting incitement to genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran already exceeds that which existed in Srebrenica and Rwanda, and which took those countries down the road to genocide. And so, as the witness testimony again and again told us, that combating, preventing such incitement is not a policy option. It's a legal obligation. State parties to the Genocide Convention, like my country, Canada, like the U.S., are obliged to undertake the remedies mandated by the Genocide Convention and international law to bring Ahmadinejad's Iran to account. Similarly, with respect to the massive domestic repression of human rights, here too one must hold Iran to account. Otherwise, and Elliot made this point, and more eloquently than I could, that we run the risk of emboldening the regime while abandoning the protesters, and doing so in a way that also sanitizes the violations as they continue in our ignoring of them and are focusing, and even here ineffectively, only on the nuclear issue. Finally, in terms of the initiatives that need to be undertaken, part of a fourfold strategy involving a comprehensive set of calibrated, targeted sanctions is because you never know, if you want to internationalize, and I believe we need to internationalize the strategic advocacy, you never know which country might respond to what set of arguments. For example, when I was in Germany and talking with German leaders, I found some of them not always responsive on the nuclear threat issue. I would hear, well, you know, it's not clear, the evidence is not conclusive that they are, in fact, seeking to develop nuclear weapons. But when I brought up the issue of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide and said, this is something that you should understand and understand the danger of the threat, that did resonate. Whereas when I went to Sweden with Swedish leaders, the human rights issue resonated more with the Swedes. So what I'm saying is we have to factor the four sets of interrelated threats into international strategic advocacy in that regard. And I close now at this point with an important matter of principle and precedent to which Elliot referred to, and he was clearly engaged in this. And that is, we did not abandon the political prisoners in the Soviet Union, nor did we abandon the Soviet Jewry movement because we were engaged, among other things, with respect to arms control agreements with the former Soviet Union. And so I end where I began. Iran, not unlike the former Soviet Union, constitutes a standing threat to international peace and security, as well as to its own people. That is what motivated some 60 leading genocide experts, international law scholars, human rights people, parliamentarians to endorse a petition titled "The Danger of a Nuclear Rights Violating, Genocidal, Inciting Iran, the Responsibility to Prevent." And I'll quote from the conclusion of this petition by this group of, as I said, scholars, parliamentarians, internationally, including amongst them a not insignificant number of Iranian human rights people and Muslim scholars and the like, who put themselves on the line and clearly, endorsing this petition. And they said as follows: bringing Ahmadinejad's Iran to account is not a policy option. It is and remains an international legal responsibility. The time has come for international action on behalf of the people of Iran, on behalf of justice, and in the pursuit of an authentic peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kotler. If I may, I just want to say that you have to distinguish between a long list of actions that need to be undertaken and the stay focusing on one goal. If we all remember that senior President Bush launched the Desert Storm operation, he complained that against Saddam Hussein, get out of Kuwait. This was the reason. And when the United States, George W. Bush went to the second Iraqi war, the cause war, you have mass destruction kind of weapons. And this is the reason why we're going out and we are decisive and resilient to achieve the goal. My concern that if you count 3 different causes, you might lose the focusing and you may find yourself with nothing. It's on.
Let me put it another way. I'm not worried that we may have 3 sets of what appear to be, but I believe they are interrelated causes, and we'll end up with nothing. I'm worried that as we meet here today, not one of the undertakings that I mentioned has yet been undertaken by any of the governments who are themselves state parties. And so, in the matter of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, the time is past when one state in the international community should have come forward to undertake its responsibilities as a state party under the Genocide Convention, obliged to prevent the incitement to genocide. What's so hard to have that kind of obligatory priority? Not to have such a priority is to sanitize the incitement to genocide and default on our obligations. Number one. Second, together with it, have a set of identifiable, comprehensive, targeted and calibrated sanctions. That's the kind of thing that will not only hold Ahmadinejad's Iran to account, but it may, in consequence, be the tipping point for the changing of the regime. Not that that should be our intention, but that can very well be the consequence. So if I had to say two priorities, those two would be them. And as a strategic way, internationalize the advocacy. When you do it, focus on the interrelated threats.
Thank you very much. Our next, last but not least, is Seema Shine. Seema Shine is an expert in international and Middle Eastern affairs. She served most of her career in different capacities in the Israeli military intelligence community. In her last position, Mrs. Shine served as the head of the research and analysis team in the intelligence division at the Israeli Prime Minister's office. After her retirement from military, she served as a deputy head of National Security Committee. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I start by saying that the question that was put before us on this panel was how and whether could we stop Iran, block Iran from becoming a military nuclear power. Well, let me start by saying, yes, we can. I'm saying that in spite of the fact that cynics will tell you that the Nobel Prize given to President Obama was intended to put handcuffs on his hands and preventing him from using harsh measures against Iran. Today, it's well established that Iran's policy since its nuclear program was revealed 7 years ago is based on cover, concealment, lies, and feet-dragging. It evolves around three main principles. The first one is advancing at the verge of legitimacy, thus exploiting to the maximum the holes in the NPT, trying to avoid a crisis that will force them to admit their real intentions. The latest, but probably not the last one, example is the Iranian announcement of the secret enrichment facility near Qom, before it assumed the West was preparing to do that, while emphasizing it was not obliged to do that according to the NPT, which is of course not the case. The second one is advancing as long as there is no real danger to its vital interests. Once it perceives real threat, Iran is willing to halt and even suspend its activities. This was the case when they accepted the suspension in 2004. It was after they were caught red-handed in 2002 and after the American attack on Iraq on March 2003. It was the Libyans before them, and then the Iranians in 2004 decided to suspend for more than a year their program. The third one is the continued activity to split the international community, using basic bazaar policy. Never say never, never say no, say always yes, but. And that's what they did just in the last example, saying yes to engagement, but immediately an Iranian counter-proposal, which does not mention the nuclear issue at all, but enables the Russians and the Chinese to use in order to advance their policies, to say, well, the Iranians are willing to engage, so let's put aside the sanctions. These three principles characterize the Iranian policy ever since their nuclear program was revealed, and one has to admit it works very good for them and quite successfully for the time being. On the other hand, unfortunately, the international community is in an everlasting dialogue with Iran, using at the same time sticks and carrots. But one has to say that what was the purpose of these sticks and carrots, while the carrots were always bigger than the sticks, was to bring the regime to stop enrichment activities. Till now, this policy seems to be futile. In these circumstances, the obvious conclusion in this stage of time is that if the West will continue with the same policy and Iran will be allowed to continue its project, Sooner or later, in spite of the developments of the last 24 hours, Iran will become a nuclear military power. I want to say that we are in a unique point of time in three aspects. In the technological aspect, on one hand, Iran has crossed the threshold and knows how to enrich uranium on an industrial scale. But, and as you all know, they have accumulated 1,500 kilograms of LEU, which, according to experts on this issue, is enough for producing iron-rich uranium for one device. On the other hand, there are a lot of disruption in the project. The secret site at Qom has been exposed, and I don't think it was at the beginning the purpose of the Iranians, and the project is not proceeding according to Iran's plan. In the economic sphere, inflation and unemployment is growing. The crisis in the banking sector is increasing, as well as in the energy, car, and textile industries. And sanctions are beginning to take their toll. All that in spite of the recent increase of the oil prices, and it's something that is not going to be changed in the coming years. I must say that these two elements are very important, but they are repairable, and they in themselves are not enough to change the direction. The third aspect is the most important one, and it has to do with the severe crisis of legitimacy that challenges the regime and was mentioned before by the other colleagues. For the first time since the revolution took power. Even though it seems that the security forces have suppressed the upheaval on the streets, underneath, it continues to boil, and a new burst of demonstration can occur every day. That's the time to start thinking about changing the paradigm, to move from a policy that aimed at persuading the regime to change its attitude, an approach that still now failed and has limited, if at all, chances with the couple Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, to a new paradigm, meaning a substantial effort to encourage the internal forces who are seeking change of Iran's regime, a regime that has lost its legitimacy with its own people. As an interim step, if Iran continues to reject the demand to stop enrichment, strong sanctions should be imposed on Iran to confront the regime with its strategic decisions. But it has to be harsh sanctions. For this to succeed, a bold and determined U.S. decision has to be taken, including willingness to press upon Russia and China and mobilize the like-minded countries. The chances for this to succeed are slim, mainly because of the continued Russian and Chinese rejection to any further sanctions. Yet, if in spite of my analysis, this policy will succeed, very good. But if not, that will be an important milestone on the road to the new paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Please go ahead. And they're here. But please do it short.
If I may, I'd like to make an observation and ask a question, both briefly. And my starting point, Mr. Chairman, is you're recalling that in 1993, the Israel Air Force took a strategic decision to invest in F-59s. I am a former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations at Geneva and to the Council for Disarmament in Geneva. But in the late 1980s, I was the liaison to the U.S. Congress in Washington. And just for the record, I would want to say that we started the campaign on the Iranian nuclear issue already in 1988. that Rabin tried to mobilize AIPAC to spread the word about the threat. Now, this campaign failed miserably because we were putting it out that Iran had the ability to develop a nuclear capacity within 5 years. And that claim was totally out of whack with U.S. intelligence assessments, and it wasn't bought, putting it simply. And this brings me to my question. It seems to me that there is still a discrepancy in the assessments, the threat assessments made by Israel and members of the 5+1. And I think it's quite clear when you get the U.S. National Security Council putting out assessments saying the threat is not so immediate. Now, in these circumstances, how big is the gap? Is it possible to harmonize the intelligence assessments? And should it be done? And I would suggest yes, because this is no light question. Policy decisions will be made on these assessments and are made. They will affect the urgency of the talks in Geneva being held today, on the one hand, and they could affect premature Israeli reactions or action if we insist on our assessment, which appears to be a lot shorter in time lead than the Western assessments.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll take another one, and then I'll let me take just one more. The lady over there. I still want to give a chance to the panelists to have some, closing remarks, each of them. So. We are running out of time. So what we'll do now is I let 1 to 2 minutes to each of the panelists just to make a closing remark. Please go ahead.
Thank you. On the questions that were asked, I think there is an enormous amount of coordination between French, British, Israeli, and American intelligence services with respect to the Iranian threat. There are differences. They will never be fully harmonized. In the case of the 2007 National Intelligence Assessment by the UN, by the U.S., the British and French really did not agree with it, as the Israelis didn't. So you'll never have full harmony, but there's a lot of coordination. Basically, the difference is, I think, that Israel is looking at a worst-case analysis. The United States is looking at a most likely case analysis, but the gap is not all that great. As I listened to my fellow panelists, it seemed to me that there's a lot of agreement here. I do think, just one word on what Dr. Abdo said, when this regime falls, whenever that is, I agree completely. We will look back at these splits among the clerics as an absolutely critical point in destroying the legitimacy of the regime in the view of the Iranian people. I do think as we talk about the negotiations as we have, and particularly as Erwin Kotler has so eloquently, we should be thinking that way, we should be dealing with them that way, but as Sima Shine said, we need a paradigm shift. I would only argue that we don't need it after certain events ensue. We need it now to start thinking about how outsiders in Europe, in Israel, the U.S., can help the people of Iran bring down the regime. We can't bring down their regime. They can, and with enough help, they will.
I'd just like to make a few observations. I do think that we're all in agreement on the fundamental points, but I would just like to sort of end my remarks and leave you with this thought, which was a very important point that Professor Litvak mentioned, which is that obviously there's a lot of concern. Obviously no one knows the outcome, but the Iranians are very influenced by inflammatory rhetoric. And this particular leadership is extremely volatile and spontaneous. And I think that the discourse is very important. And we're at a very critical time. The Iranians believe, as far as the information I'm receiving, that the United States is not the problem in terms of a military attack, it's Israel. And they are very concerned about Israel at this point, which is why I've been told they're making at least some pretense at cooperating during these negotiations. So they're watching Israel, they're very concerned about Israel, which makes it so important for the rhetoric not to be inflammatory. And I think that the Iranians, as we have often compared in this discussion with the former Soviet Union, the Iranians read everything. They have a special ministry that monitors the media every day. They can tell you every journalist around the world that's writing about them. They have files on everyone, including myself. They monitor everything that is discussed about their country every day of the year. So I think that the language at this juncture is extremely important. Thank you. And I just want to, if you allow me, one plug. If any of you are interested in these kind of internal dynamics that I discussed during my remarks, the website that I just launched as part of the program I'm conducting at the think tank where I work is www.insideiran.org. And this is a website that is an attempt to provide information from inside the country, provided by scholars and analysts, people who actually have knowledge and information. Thank you.
Professor Muttalib.
Just the young lady, but the young lady you asked about Chavez's Venezuela. Iran supports any regime, anyone, anywhere in the world that acts anti-American, anti-Western. In fact, the Holocaust denial has been used very effectively also to appeal to segments of European public opinion that may be inclined to being extreme rightists. That's often forgotten. Ahmadinejad probably didn't know much about the Holocaust in the first place, but probably got the idea from some of his advisors. It worked. I know Irving Kotler is upset about it, but that's one thing. The other is it works. It's effective. It's no worse, no better than in terms of effectiveness than what the Marxists and communists did for years in looking at conspiracies by capitalists and American corporations around the world. So they believe it. It works. About intelligence coordination, there is a consensus that Iran is out to deceive us, that they will probably get it. My own feeling is that we'll give up, in the sense the United States, considering its problems in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan, may decide to, and Hillary Clinton said it some time ago, that will just merely cover the Middle East moderate countries and Israel with a nuclear umbrella. Remains to be seen.
Professor Litvak.
Go ahead. Okay, I'll be very brief. I think Professor Kotler articulated much better than I can ever do the way what should be done about Iran. One thing. Secondly, I think oil is a very important issue. That is, if the West will be able to reduce consumption of oil, it will be very effective against Iran. Whenever oil prices go below $60 per barrel, Iran does not make much profit. If it goes below $55 per barrel, Iran is losing money. Iran has swallowed in the past 2 years more than $30 billion of its foreign currency reserves. If the current economic policy will continue, they will be left without any foreign currency reserves within 2 or 3 years. That is, if the West should stop wasting oil, that would be very effective against Iran. And finally, one short comment about the nuclear discrepancies. One thing I think is the American intelligence community got its hands burned after the Iraqi fiasco, and therefore they were overcautious about Iran. And unless they show clear proof which is accepted by court of law, they would not accept the Iranian threat. I think they have changed their position. Secondly, there was a difference between what Israel said and what the U.S. said. Israel spoke about the point of no return regarding technological capability. That is, Iran reached a certain stage, which they, by the way, reached now, that now, even if they are stopped, they can renew their effort any time. That is, now they know what to do. And that is, you cannot destroy their knowledge. The U.S. spoke about when they will have a bomb. So we spoke about two different time scales, and this was one reason, in addition to what Elliot Abrams said, that we took a worst-case scenario, and they took a much more lenient scenario. But we also spoke in different languages.
The person who spoke about being involved in the 80s with respect to Iran was Neville Landon. He didn't identify himself, so I will identify him. I'm doing that as well, Neville, because I think sitting in this audience is a young woman who 20 years later, her name is Simone Hartmann, who's organized a movement in Germany and Austria. There she is, and she deserves a lot of credit for showing what one person can do in organizing a movement called Stop the Bomb in Germany, Austria, and beyond. But I just want to say on the matter of the intelligence cooperation, my own sense is, and this is something that has encouraged me, is on the matter of, for example, the disclosure re the Qum facility, the secret facility in Iran, the U.S. was prepared to acknowledge that it was in part also due to Israeli intelligence in that regard. So it showed the close cooperation between intelligence services in Israel and the P+1, but also the fact that the Americans apparently knew about this, at least the CIA, 3 years ago, which means that there was a contradiction in the American intelligence services in terms of their national intelligence estimate at the time, denying, weaponization, while they knew, at least some of them knew about the code. So a lot of things go on in intelligence circles that are sometimes not even known to the intelligence people themselves from the same country. The second thing I wanted to mention, because a woman mentioned about Venezuela. I think my reference to Argentina and to the fact that Iran is a threat to international peace and security was intended to include, and maybe I should have been more specific, the Iranian penetration into Latin America. That should not be ignored. And the final thing, and this is for everyone here, there are different people here from different countries, and I would encourage you to urge your legislators from your various countries that they enact domestic legislation to put some of these remedies with which we were talking about into effect. I know that in Canada I introduced a bill called the Iran Accountability Act, which speaks to much of which I was referring here today in the United States. Some congressmen have introduced legislation. We need, in effect, to develop template legislation in different countries that, taken together, will be a critical mass of advocacy, along with the internationalized advocacy, to hold Iran to account.
Thank you.
I want to say, first of all, that the clock does not stop, and that's a fact, does not stop for a second. And the same is with the Iranian nuclear program as well. We have to remember we are talking and talking, but at the same time they are continuing with their program. There is one country that we, the Israelis, and probably others also, call a superpower, and that is, as you know, the US. And I think it will be an historic mistake if, as a consequence of what some people perceive to be a war for the wrong reason in Iraq, which I don't think, but there are a lot that do, Iran will be left to become a nuclear military country. That's all.
Thanks each of the panelists for a very interesting things that they said, and unfortunately, I believe that we will continue to deal and to discuss this issue for a long time. Thank you very much.